He's the new Liberal leader with the historic Liberal name, Justin Trudeau.
My father wasn't a political mentor to me, he was my father.
The day after his convention win, the 6'2", 41-year-old suggested we meet him at a downtown Ottawa public library.
Probably my favorite outing as a kid. The idea that every single shelf was filled with stories, with books, that there was never going to be enough time to read them all. It was almost magical.
Justin Trudeau, our guest this week. You know, I left that hall last night. There were a lot of Liberals who were obviously excited, been a good evening for them. But they were also convinced that, they could win power 2 years from now. They could form a government. How do you manage expectations? You'd have to have 5 times more seats than you got now. I mean, is that realistic to even think about?
Managing expectations is easy because the reality is we only have 35 seats in the House of Commons, and that's why throughout this campaign I've talked about the hard work we have to do. Now we look at the landscape, and yes, we're in a very difficult position as a Liberal Party, but for me it's also a tremendous opportunity to rethink what a political party should be in the 21st century in a way that we wouldn't be able to if we had 100 seats. And what I'm banking on is that Canadians are willing to look at politics a different way. And the challenge that we have of responding to that and building that from scratch means an awful lot of work, but it also means that we're going to be able to capitalize, hopefully, on some big trends that will happen by 2015. People tired of a government that's tone is out of touch, top-down, arrogant, nasty, divisive, an opposition that is to one extent taken on a similar sort of approach, and to another extent has internal divisions, whether it's a party of the conscience of Parliament or whether it's a governing party ready to compromise on issues.
Is it the big roll of the dice, though? And I ask that because, I can recall talking to, a Liberal who's been in the party for a fair amount of times, big fan of yours, in the last few weeks, who said, this has to happen. It has to happen now, your leadership, because this is the last chance we got. If this doesn't work, it's pretty bleak.
Well, what is the if this that doesn't work? I'm putting forward a message of hope and hard work, and I'm not skipping any steps. We're, the image we were talking about today in one of our meetings was, when you roll a rock up a hill, you roll it a few feet, you stick in a peg, you breathe. You roll it a few more feet, you stick in another peg. I mean, this is not going to happen overnight.
Well, that's my point about expectations and managing them. When they leave the room thinking they could form government in 2 years.
Well,
is that a realistic thought?
It doesn't matter whether it's a realistic thought or not. What matters is that they're willing to do the work that we're going to take to get into contention in 2 years. And the idea of a last chance, well, they have a last chance as someone who's young enough to say, what, we'll do multiple tries at this if we have to. We will earn the trust of Canadians.
The Conservatives have made it clear, and to no one's surprise, that they're going to go after you in 2 key areas, judgment and experience. How do you fight that?
First of all, I've learned from across the country that Canadians are tired of being cynical. They don't want this. Now, every political theorist can tell you, yes, negative attack ads work.
You don't need to be a theorist.
Well,
you
no,
can be
you
a
can
former
see
Liberal.
Well, there you go.
No, it's stamped right on the tombstones of Ignatieff and
there is an approach
that kind of attack worked.
Mr. Harper has a majority government today because of the politics of negativity and division. There's no question about that. This is what they've grown to be able to do, exceedingly well. Now the issue is, once you've gone and divided the country against itself and made people cynical about every political figure out there, because it's not about lifting up Mr. Harper, it's about beating down anyone else. Once Canadians no longer believe that there's anything good in politics, Well, that they no longer feel that we can work together to solve the challenges we're facing. And that is my fundamental motivation. How do we work together as a country to solve the big challenges we're facing? And you can't, even if attack ads work, you can't get to where we need to go through using them. So I have to say, and I'm glad to say, no, I'm not going to play up those attacks, and they will come at me for on my judgment because I offered literally my shirt to a charity for cancer, the Canadian Liver Foundation, or for various cancers that I parade around as my evil twin with my own mustache. The challenge that I have. Is to get Canadians to move away from, oh, look at that fellow in his undershirt, he mustn't have much judgment, to, oh, look at Mr. Harper raising taxes on tricycles and baby clothes. He must have very poor judgment. And I do that in a way that is positive, not in negative.
And you think people will buy that? They will see the difference?
I'm gambling on that. I'm gambling my entire career on Canadians being better and Canadians being worthy of an intelligent discourse that is willing to call on their intelligence and not their fears and their insecurities.
I want to talk about the NDP for a moment, because after this weekend, not only were you elected as leader, but they kind of changed their tone. They dropped the socialism word from their jargon, and they're clearly going after the middle ground, the middle class, and center ground in Canadian politics. So do the Liberals. Is there room for two parties in the centre?
The room for three parties, because the Conservatives have certainly not been governing like fiscal hawks in their profligate spending even before spending away a $13 billion surplus before the worldwide recession hit in 2008.
But do you really think all three parties are in the centre now?
I think they're moving there, but I also know that despite the absence of the word socialism from the preamble of the NDP Constitution today, they are tied to an ideology of the left the way the Conservatives are anchored to an ideology of the right. And the Liberal Party is a party of pragmatic solutions based and drawn from our shared values and built around the kind of evidence and science that shows the way forward. And that is, I think, the strength. Of course, all parties are moving towards the center of the spectrum. That's where Canadians are.
What do you say to those who believe in the progressive side of politics, who argue at the same time that two parties fighting for the progressive vote will only ensure conservative governments for the future?
I think that those people don't necessarily understand the political spectrum in this country, which is not about right and left, but about right, left, and center. And there are too many issues that the NDP stands for that I do not agree with, whether it's their distrust of trade, which for me is going to be an essential piece of middle-class prosperity. Export-intensive industries pay in general 50% higher salaries than non-export-intensive industries. We need trade because that leads to good middle-class jobs. And the NDP is definitely very troubled and even anti-trade in many situations. Similarly, in their approach to Quebec is an extension of what I see as the kind of dangerous approach that the progressive Conservatives had when they created a coalition with Lucien Bouchard and his soft nationalists. For me, that's not the direction we need to go, and there are too many things that I'm not willing to make compromises on to win at all costs. And that's the other issue. I mean, Canadians are tired of this, win at all costs mentality that the Conservatives are putting forward. I don't believe in taking away choices from Canadians and say, okay, you know what, you Canadians, you can't seem to figure out how to get this right because 60% of you don't like Mr. Harper, but we still keep getting him as a government. What we're going to do is we're going to make it simpler for you Canadians. We're going to remove choices from you at the ballot box, and then you'll figure out how to make a responsible No, I believe in even giving more choices to electors. And that's why in the next election, in 338 ridings right across this country, there will be extraordinarily strong, grounded community leaders as Liberal candidates.
Let me ask you two specific questions on the economy that all Canadians understand, because they've heard them debated either for years or for decades. One's on the deficit.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you? Do you believe that deficit should continue to come down to please financial markets? Or do you believe that deficits can either stay where they are or increase in the belief that that stimulates the economy and creates jobs? Which side are you on?
I'm definitely someone who thinks that the deficit should come down. I'd much rather be part of a government with a surplus than a deficit. But that doesn't mean I'm opposed to borrowing when we need to. If we need to stimulate the economy, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going to the bank and taking out a loan of $1,000. If you go and spend it on a new flat screen TV, that's different if you go and invest it in your buddy's startup company out of his garage and he goes on to succeed. One way you're going to have trouble paying back that debt. Another way you're going to profit from it, and it's keeping the economy rolling. So
does the economy need to be stimulated right now?
No. No, the economy needs to be managed right now. I think we are already deeply into deficit. We need to get out of deficit. The way to do that is to grow the economy. The way to do that is to make sure that we're not dogmatic about it. Mr. Harper and Mr. Flaherty have set up a specific target of we have to eliminate the deficit for 2015 just before the election, perhaps so we can offer all sorts of goodies to Canadians in a 2015 election campaign. And that's a political target that they are adjusting the reality of everything else around. They say we need infrastructure spending. That's great, but they're reducing infrastructure spending and promising to raise it after their mandate is over in 2016. They say we need to invest in skills development and training, but we're going to take 2 years to negotiate extremely difficult agreements where the provinces are going to have to come up with new money and the private sector is going to have to come up with money before we actually spend money.
F-35s, billions of dollars for a new fighter, fifth generation fighter, a stealth fighter. Where are you on that? Do you think this country needs a new fighter aircraft? That this is where billions of dollars should be spent, whether it's the F-35 or some other model? Is this something you think Canada needs at this time?
Yes, we have a modern military. It will never be a huge military, but it needs to be an agile, lethal, force for an extension of Canadian foreign policy, for peacekeeping, peacemaking, for responding to counterinsurrection. I believe in the Canadian military, not because we've always been peacekeepers, but we earned our right to be peacekeepers through the second half of the 21st century by stepping up in the trenches of World War I and the beaches of World War II way above our weight class. And we continue to need to be a force for peace in the world. So yes, we need to make sure that our Army and our Canadian forces have the equipment they need. Now, is that the F-35? Is it the 50, or is it the Gripen, or is it the Eurofighter? I mean, that's a conversation we have to have that's based around what our Canadian military will actually be used for. We haven't had a conversation about what kind of peacekeeping or peacemaking or counterinsurrection or support of NATO that we're going to have. We're not having a very serious conversation about what our expectations are of the Canadian forces and what they're going to be required to do in the coming years. And for me, that's the starting point. Not, is this the fanciest jet we can give, but is this the jet that we are going to need to keep our troops effective and safe, and to achieve our foreign policy and policy goals to create a more secure world. That's a conversation we haven't had yet that for me is way overdue, and all the examples of the incredible wastefulness of the loss of time, the loss of money, and the loss of confidence in this government's capacity to do one thing right, to give our troops the tools they need at the best price for Canadians. Well, they've failed in the F-35s, perhaps even in the shipbuilding contracts, which we're starting to see questions about. I mean, this is one of the basic responsibilities of a government that is a failure so far.
Last question, and let me try to ask this as fairly as I can, because it's only a couple of hours after something has happened that clearly was not an accident in Boston. People have died, many people are injured. You're the Canadian Prime Minister. What do you do?
First thing, you offer support and sympathy and condolences, and can we send down EMTs, or I mean, as we contributed after 9/11. I mean, is there any material immediate support we have we can offer? And then at the same time, over the coming days, we have to look at the root causes. Now, we don't know now whether it was terrorism or a single crazy or a domestic issue or a foreign issue. I mean, all those are questions. But there is no question that this happened because there is someone who feels completely excluded, completely at war with innocence, at war with a society. And our approach has to be, okay, where do those tensions come from? I mean, yes, we need to make sure that we're promoting security and we're, keeping our borders safe and monitoring the kinds of violent subgroups that happen around. But we also have to monitor and encourage people to not point fingers at each other and lay blame for personal ills or societal ills on a specific group, whether it be the West or the government or Bostonians or whatever it is. Because it's that idea of dividing humans against ourselves, of pointing out that they're not like us, and in order to achieve our political goals, we can kill innocents here. That's something that no society in the world that is healthy, regardless of ideology, will accept. And yet, it's something that is happening increasingly across this world. And we have to focus seriously on how we're raising kids to be open and accepting of diversity and shared values, and understand that we have a world to build together, not in spite of each other. And that's the bigger conversation we have to have.
A number of other major cities in the United States, whether because they've heard something or been told something or not, have gone on kind of full alert, moved people into specific areas to be prepared in case something larger than Boston is going on. Would you be picking up the phone, talking to the RCMP, CSIS, Border Patrol,
of course,
Armed Forces?
Of course, I'd be worried about what specific targets there are, but there will always be more targets, more shopping centers, more public events, more gatherings than we can evacuate or than we can deal with. I mean, there is a need for security and response and being proactive and making sure that we have information, but we also need to make sure that as we go forward, we don't emphasize a culture of fear and mistrust, because that ends up marginalizing even further people who are already feeling like they are enemies of society, rather than people who have hope for the future and faith that we can work together and succeed.
18-year-old Justin Trudeau is now a student at a community college in Montreal. It's one of many Quebec colleges gearing up for a referendum next week on the question of Quebec's place in Canada.
The debate is on at 31 colleges among 74,000 students. Arguing the federal case at Collège Jean Brébeuf today was the son of its most famous alumnus. Justin Trudeau and his team were lonely voices for the Confederation. Lonely and unpopular. Later, with a trademark family shrug, the young Trudeau said he doesn't much care what his peers think of his views.
Everyone's got peer pressure at this age. I mean, there's pressure to smoke, there's pressure to do all sorts of stuff. And I've never been affected by peer pressure. Never.
You've faced a lot of challenges in your life. Is this the biggest one?
this is an extension of the single greatest challenge I face in my life every day, which is how do I do right with what I've been given in my life. That was the challenge that I answered by choosing to become a high school teacher. That's the challenge I answered by my work with Katimavik and with nonprofit organizations across the country. That's the challenge I stepped up to face when I said I can be a good representative for the people of Papineau. Every single day I think about how am I doing the best I can to make the world a better place for my kids, with what I have at my disposal. And
do you really think that every single day? I know you say that.
Any day I'm making a decision about something that I should do or something that I want to do or something that I can do, yeah. I mean, there are days I'm glad to kick my feet up on the couch and play Angry Birds for a few hours. But there are other days. Are you any good at Angry Birds? Not really. But there are other days that I don't necessarily feel like going out to yet another event instead of putting my kids to bed. But I know that this is something that I do because it's making a better world for my kids and all the others.
We'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter.